She walked for miles on earth and stone, without shoes, guided by the hope that that sacrifice would be enough to save those she loved. But can the heart endure when the strength is gone? Alyssa felt the dry and cracked earth beneath her feet, which were already injured and bleeding. The hot desert wind cut into his face, and every step was a fight against his own body, which begged for rest. On the horizon, the relentless sun seemed to mock her, casting long, distorted shadows across the barren ground. She had been walking for days without shoes, her feet burning on the scorching ground. But Alyssa had no choice. Her family depended on her, and she knew that if she stopped now, hunger would consume them. The city she was looking for seemed like a distant mirage, always out of reach. His thoughts, however, were with his children, who were left behind, frail and malnourished. "I can't fail them," she repeated to herself like a mantra. Every time the pain in her feet became unbearable, every time her knees gave way, she thought of the fading smile of her youngest daughter, Emily, who could barely speak due to hunger. Alyssa's husband, Jack, a once strong and hopeful man, was now struck down by illness. Poverty had struck his family like a silent plague, robbing them of their vitality, one day at a time. The lack of rain had destroyed their crops, and food was scarce on the shelves of the house, until only emptiness remained. Jack, incapacitated by the fever, could barely move, leaving Alyssa alone to carry the burden of saving them all. She remembered the moment Jack took her arm, his touch weak and shaky, and said, "You need to go, Alyssa. You need to get to town before it's too late." His voice, so different from the vibrant man she knew, still echoed in her mind. Jack never asked for help, always proud, always determined to solve things alone. Seeing that man broken, begging for something he could no longer control, broke her heart. With tears in her eyes, she promised him that she would return with food. They had no money, but Alyssa heard rumors that in a distant city they were distributing rations to desperate families. However, getting there seemed like an impossible task. The distance of 100 miles seemed like an eternity, especially for someone as tired as she was. But she went. He left in the dead of night, while his children were sleeping, to avoid the despair in their eyes. Now, miles away, she could only count on the strength of her determination. Thirst dried his mouth. His lips cracked and his skin burned. Every time she stopped to breathe, her body threatened to not continue. However, the image of her children forced her to rise again. "Come on, Alyssa," she muttered to herself. "You can do it." But could she do it? She remembered the last meal they were able to share as a family, some hard, dry rice, divided into tiny portions. With every bite, Alyssa felt the weight of guilt. As a mother, she was supposed to protect them, but now all she could offer was despair. That was the last day Jack was able to get out of bed, and she knew that if she didn't bring him food soon, neither he nor the children might survive. Time was his enemy. With each passing day, the weakness increased. She had already lost count of the days. How many nights had he spent sleeping out in the open, without any shelter? How many times had she imagined that she would hear Jack's voice calling to her, or the children's laughter? But it was just the wind. The loneliness of the journey was almost as painful as the hunger. But she continued. Night was falling, and Alyssa knew she needed to find somewhere to rest. The desert became dangerous at night, with the freezing winds and creatures that came out of the shadows. But even with the fear, exhaustion weighed on his bones. His feet, now blistered, throbbed with each step. She saw a dry tree in the distance and decided that was where she would spend the night. It wasn't safe, but despair had already taken away his prudence. All he cared about was surviving so his family could survive too. She huddled under the tree, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to contain the cold. The moon, high in the sky, seemed as indifferent as the sun had been during the day. Closing her eyes, she prayed. She was not a religious woman, but in that moment, Alyssa was clinging to any hope, any strength that could help her carry on. Before falling asleep, he thought about Emily's small hands, holding his so tightly the day he left. She couldn't fail. I couldn't disappoint those I loved. With this thought, Alyssa fell asleep, not knowing if she would have the strength to wake up the next morning. Alyssa woke up to the first rays of the sun, which barely touched the horizon. The cold of the night was still on her body, and she felt stiff. His mouth was as dry as the surrounding desert, and his throat burned with a thirst that seemed impossible to quench. She looked down at her feet, which were now a mixture of burst blisters, open sores, and burned skin from the unrelenting heat of the ground. But there was no time to mourn. Her children were waiting for her, and she needed to continue. Stretching to her feet, Alyssa felt the pain radiate through her legs like needles piercing every muscle. "It's all for them," he thought. Her mind repeated that phrase like an endless cycle, a reminder of why she couldn't stop. But at the same time, she fought the dark thoughts that were beginning to invade her mind. What if she couldn't? What if, after all, her children were lost forever, victims of a relentless famine that she could not stop? Every step he took was an act of pure will. She forced herself to keep going, even when her body screamed to stop. The sky, vibrant blue, seemed indifferent to his suffering. The heat was starting to increase as the sun rose, and Alyssa knew she needed to find water. Her strength reserves were running low, and without some relief, she didn't know how much longer her body could hold out. Thoughts of her family kept her upright. He remembered Jack before the illness weakened him, how he was able to make children laugh, even in the most difficult times. He remembered Emily running through the fields around the house, her laughter echoing in the air like a melody that now seemed so far away. Where would that laugh be now? Would Emily be alive when Alyssa returned? The thought of not hearing that sound again made a lump form in his throat. The anguish crushed her, but it also drove her. As the hours passed, the barren landscape never seemed to change. Everything around was silent, except for the sound of his own faint, panting steps. At one point, she tripped over a rock and fell to her knees. Pain exploded in her leg, and she screamed, alone in the desert, a cry of despair that seemed to resonate throughout the empty expanse. For a moment, he remained there on his knees without the strength to stand up. "I can't do it anymore," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse and broken. But then something deep inside her reignited. It wasn't just for her. It wasn't just the fear of dying there alone. It was for them, for the faces she loved, for the lives she promised to save. With a determination that seemed impossible in her state, Alyssa pressed her hands against the rough floor and stood up again. The pain was unbearable, but she couldn't give in to it. Not yet. She continued to walk, with tears in her eyes and a heart that felt heavier with each step. The sun burned her skin, but Alyssa barely noticed the heat. "I was immersed in a daze, a state between consciousness and total exhaustion. But then, in the distance, she saw something. A flickering shadow, almost imperceptible. Is it an illusion, she thought, but it was all she had. She forced herself to move toward the shadow, each step more difficult than the last. When he finally got close enough to make it out, he realized that it was a small building, a simple wooden shelter, probably left by someone who once crossed that path. Alyssa felt a wave of relief and despair at the same time. It wasn't the city, but it was a place where you could protect yourself from the sun. Maybe there was water. With the last strength she had left, she pushed the wooden door that creaked with the weight of time. The interior was dark, stuffy, but inside she found a small barrel of water, almost empty. It didn't matter. For her it was a miracle. Alyssa drank carefully, savoring every drop, as if they were the only thing keeping her connected to life. She sat down on the dirt floor, leaning against the wall, finally allowing her body to collapse, if only for a brief moment. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the sweat and dust, and she allowed herself to feel the pain and sadness she had been holding in for so long. She was closer to her goal, but she still didn't know if she would make it in time. Alyssa woke up hours later, her muscles still throbbing with pain. Darkness now enveloped the small shelter, and the silence was heavy. She realized that, for a brief moment, she had forgotten the burden she was carrying. For a few minutes, his mind found peace, but the weight of reality soon returned with a vengeance. Her children were still there, waiting for something she might not be able to bring. The mere thought of Emily and Jack, both weakened by hunger, brought a wave of overwhelming despair. The nearly dry water drum was all that remained. She drank some more, rationing the drops, as if she could postpone the decision to get up again. His body screamed for rest, but survival left no room for luxuries. There was no time to regret, no room for weakness. Jack was dying. Emily too. If she didn't reach the city in time, all the effort would be in vain. With a heavy sigh, Alyssa crawled out of the shelter. The night wind was chilly, a contrast to the oppressive heat of the day. Every step he took was a battle against his own limits. She began to feel a strange dissociation, as if her body no longer belonged to her, as if she were observing herself from afar. However, she continued. As she walked, hunger gripped her stomach, a deep pain that made her double over from time to time. It was as if her body was rebelling against her, refusing to move forward. But Alyssa, even though she was in pieces, refused to give up. "I have to survive. For them," he repeated in his mind. It was all he had. What moved her was no longer a simple physical need, but desperate love for her family. The path before him seemed endless, an expanse of desolation that reflected the state of his soul. But the blunt truth was simple. Either she got to town or her family would die. Alyssa crawled through the dark night, her bare feet cut by the sharp rocks that covered the ground. The pain was so intense that at times she could barely stand, but the thought of Jack and Emily kept her from stopping. The feeling of helplessness threatened to suffocate her. Every step was torture. Every breath seemed to be forcibly ripped from his lungs. And still she moved forward. The night sky was covered in stars, indifferent to his suffering, and the silence of the surrounding desert seemed to mock his loneliness. Alyssa felt small, almost insignificant, in the face of the immensity of the world. But at the same time, he knew his battle was everything. Her family's life depended on every decision, every second she could resist. Hunger throbbed in his stomach, and thirst turned his mouth into a desert even drier than the one he was crossing. She remembered an afternoon years ago, when Jack brought Emily into the world. She was a strong child, crying loudly as Alyssa held her for the first time. Jack's laughter at seeing his daughter so full of life now seemed like a distant memory. But she clung to that moment, that feeling that everything could work out, that life was stronger than pain. Now, in the present, Emily could barely get out of bed. The girl's blank look was engraved in Alyssa's mind, and it was this look that drove her. The idea that she could be her daughter's only chance of survival made her endure pain that seemed inhuman. Alyssa's body was broken, but her spirit, fueled by the need to save her family, was indomitable. The night progressed, and the temperature dropped drastically. Alyssa trembled, each gust of wind cutting her skin like razors. He felt on the verge of collapse, but he couldn't stop. Each step forward was a victory over despair, proof that, even in the face of a journey that seemed impossible, she was still standing, surviving. The hours stretched out like an eternity as Alyssa continued her tortuous walk. His body was on the verge of collapse. The pain in her feet now felt like a part of her, a constant companion that reminded her of her fragility. She no longer knew whether she was walking or just floating between consciousness and despair. The only sound was the shuffle of their feet against the dry earth, the echo of a struggle that seemed to have no end. Alyssa's thoughts turned to Jack once again. She remembered when he first got sick, how they tried to ignore the signs at first. "It's just a cold," he said with a weak smile, trying to protect his family from the weight of that truth that they both knew was inevitable. But the cold turned into something much darker, and as the illness progressed, Jack became a shadow of the man she once knew. The pain in his eyes, the guilt for no longer being able to support his family, left him distant, isolated in his own suffering. Alyssa felt her chest tighten when she thought about how he looked at her before leaving on this journey. "Go, please. We have no other choice." His voice was choked, and his body was too weak to move forward. But he never cried. Jack, even devastated by the illness, remained firm, as if the entire weight of responsibility fell on her. This only motivated her more to continue, despite the fatigue that dominated every cell in her body. The darkness around her was suffocating, And Alyssa knew that if she didn't find shelter soon, the cold could be her undoing. She looked around, looking for any sign of safety, but the desert seemed endless. The wind increased, whistling in her ears, and she huddled, trying to protect herself with her thin, trembling arms. Suddenly, his eyes caught something in the distance. A small beam of light, so far away it seemed like an unlikely miracle. Will it be a city? Alyssa's heart quickened, and for the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope. But would it be real? Or just your mind, exhausted and desperate, playing tricks? There was no way of knowing, but she knew she had to try. Trading pain for hope, Alyssa gathered the last of her strength and began to walk towards that light, knowing that perhaps it was her last chance to save those she loved. Alyssa moved toward the light as if her life depended on it. And indeed it did. Each step seemed heavier than the last. His legs shook and his head spun, the result of exhaustion and hunger. The beam of light, however small, was his only hope. She knew she needed to continue, despite the excruciating pain coursing through her body. It was as if with every movement, his body screamed for help, but his mind refused to give in. His family's survival was what kept his feet moving. Alyssa's thoughts turned to Emily. She remembered the last time she held her small hand, so fragile and cold. The girl, who before had a sparkle in her eyes, now seemed just a shadow of her former self. "Mommy, when are you coming back?" Emily's words echoed in Alyssa's mind like an arrow to the chest. Promising her daughter that she would return with food and seeing her smile return was what gave her strength, even when despair threatened to overwhelm her. Alyssa fought against the daydreams that arose as a result of the fever that was beginning to take over her body. She saw Jack's face in her mind, remembering how he, in his fragility, still found the strength to calm her. "We'll make it, Alyssa. Trust me." Those words, even if distant, still carried hope, although reality screamed otherwise. The wind intensified, lifting the sand around it. With each blast, she felt her skin being punished, but she no longer cared about the physical pain. All that mattered was the light ahead, which seemed to flicker like a promise. The closer he got, the more his heart accelerated. What if it was a mirage? What if there was no one there to help her? Fear paralyzed her, but despair was greater. Finally, Alyssa arrived at what appeared to be a small cabin, with a dim light shining through the window. She hesitated for a second, afraid that this wasn't real, that her mind was playing a trick. But he knocked on the door with weak fists, almost without strength. "Please, someone. Help me," he whispered, his voice broken. For a moment, everything remained silent, and Alyssa felt the weight of failure almost crush her. But then the door slowly opened, and a woman with a tired face looked at her in surprise. "Come in quickly," said the woman, pulling Alyssa inside. Alyssa fell to her knees on the ground, without the strength to say thank you. Tears streamed down her face as, for the first time in days, she felt like she might have a chance. Surviving was no longer a matter of hope, but of faith. Inside the cabin, the heat was almost unbearable, but Alyssa barely felt it. Her body was already numb from pain and exhaustion, and all she could think was that, for a brief moment, she was safe. The woman, who had pulled her inside, looked at her with a mixture of concern and surprise. His eyes searched every detail of Alyssa, as if trying to understand how someone could have survived in that state. "Did you walk this entire desert alone?" The woman's voice was low, but filled with disbelief. Alyssa tried to respond, but her mouth was so dry that she could barely form words. The woman brought a glass of water, and with shaking hands, Alyssa took small sips, feeling the cool liquid soothe her sore throat. "My family. They're dying," were the first words Alyssa managed to mutter, her voice broken by agony and guilt. As he said it out loud, the reality of the situation seemed even more cruel. She had walked so far, fought against the impossible, but would she arrive in time to save those she loved? The woman, without saying anything, began to prepare some food. The smell of soup filled the air, and Alyssa felt her stomach tighten painfully. It was the first meal I'd felt in days, but the mere thought of eating brought a wave of guilt. Her children were starving while she, here, was about to feed herself. "You need strength if you want to save them," said the woman, as if she could read his thoughts. Alyssa looked at her, her eyes filling with tears. That woman didn't know her, she didn't know anything about her life. But somehow she seemed to understand the weight that Alyssa carried in her heart. With shaking hands, she picked up the bowl of soup and ate, feeling her body warm from the inside even as her mind wandered back to Jack and Emily, weak and helpless. "You'll be able to get to them," the woman said, without Alyssa needing to ask. Those words, simple as they were, made Alyssa cry. For the first time in days, someone believed she had a chance. And it rekindled something inside her, a small flame of hope that had been extinguished in the desert. She needed to survive, not for herself but for them. The journey was not yet over. Alyssa felt tears rolling down her face as the soup warmed her weakened body. Each sip brought a mixture of relief and guilt, for while she ate, her children continued to fight for their lives, hungry and helpless. But something in the words of that woman, a stranger who knew nothing about her, brought a temporary peace that Alyssa hadn't experienced in days. She needed to believe that there was still time, that her fight could still save them. "There's a town a few miles away," said the woman, as she tidied up the small cabin. "That's where you need to go. They have help, food, water. If you go now, maybe you can get back with what you need before it's too late." Alyssa looked at the woman, feeling her heart race with the mixture of fear and hope. The city wasn't that far away, but time was against her. She knew that with every passing minute, Jack and Emily grew weaker, and the uncertainty of their condition weighed like an anchor on her soul. "I'll help you," the woman continued, taking a small bag and filling it with what little she had. "You can't make this trip without something to sustain you." That woman's unexpected generosity made Alyssa's chest tighten with emotion. For a brief moment, Alyssa felt that the world still had some kindness in it, even in the midst of so much despair. When morning finally began to dawn, Alyssa knew she couldn't waste any more time. With her feet still injured and her body exhausted, she accepted the offered help, tying the bag around her shoulder. She turned to the woman, not sure what to say. "Thank you" seemed so small compared to the magnitude of what I had received. A new chance, a new hope. "Go and don't look back," the woman said, her voice firm. "Your children need you. And you will save them." These words echoed in Alyssa's heart as she walked out of the cabin and faced the vastness of the desert again. She was stronger now, with a renewed purpose. But still, the journey would be relentless. With every step he took, the thought of Emily and Jack became more intense, more painful. She knew that at this point time was running out. But Alyssa also knew an indisputable truth. As long as she was breathing, as long as her feet could move, she would not stop. His family's survival depended on it. Alyssa walked again, feeling the weight of the bag on her shoulders, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. The rising sun was still low on the horizon, casting a soft light over the vastness of the desert. Each step he took felt firmer than the last, despite the incessant pain that throbbed in his feet. She knew she couldn't stop now. Jack and Emily were on her mind every moment, their images driving her to continue. As he walked forward, the woman's words echoed in his head. "You will save them." The certainty of that sentence was something Alyssa desperately needed to believe. She clung to it as if it were her only anchor, a promise that all that suffering, all the physical and emotional pain, could still have meaning. It was a race against time, and she knew that the distance to the city wasn't the only obstacle. Her mind and body were on the verge of collapse, but her love for her family kept her going. The desert seemed endless. The heat began to increase, and the sunlight reflected off the sand, almost blinding his tired eyes. Alyssa felt her energy waning, but whenever she weakened, she imagined the faces of her children. Emily with her big, innocent eyes, and Jack with his eyes weakened but still full of hope. It was for them that she walked, for them that she fought. Suddenly, Alyssa saw something on the horizon. The city, finally. She almost couldn't believe it. His vision was blurred with fatigue, but the outline of the buildings in the distance was unmistakable. Alyssa's heart quickened. A wave of emotion rushed through her, bringing tears to her eyes. She had come so far, resisted so much, and now the help her family needed so much was there, at her fingertips. With shaky steps, she increased her pace. Getting closer and closer, she felt her body giving in to exhaustion, but now it was no longer possible to stop. Alyssa knew there was still one last battle ahead of her. Getting the supplies and getting back in time. Their children needed to survive. And that hope was the only thing that kept her breathing. When he finally reached the city limits, his legs gave way. She fell to her knees at the entrance, her entire body shaking. But Alyssa wouldn't give up now. She had come so far, and as much as her body begged for rest, her heart knew the fight wasn't over yet. Alyssa was on her knees, her vision blurred by tears and exhaustion. The voices around the city were a distant hum as his body shook with exhaustion. She knew she needed help, but everything seemed like a blur. Somehow, the words came out of his mouth, barely audible, begging for help. "My family. They are dying. I need food, water. Please." Someone approached. Firm but gentle hands lifted her off the ground, and soon she found herself being led inside a small aid station. The room was simple, with shelves full of rations and bottled water. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. The sight of the provisions made his heart beat faster, but it also brought deep pain. She was there, so close to saving her family, but the fear of not getting there in time consumed her. "Please. My children." His voice trembled. The woman who helped her listened carefully and quickly calmed her down. "We'll give you what you need," the woman said, filling a bag with supplies. "But you need to rest, eat something first. You won't be able to come back like this." Alyssa looked at the food in her hands hesitantly. The image of Emily, weak and powerless, filled his mind. She wanted to devour everything at that moment, but she knew that every second wasted was a life that could slip away. Still, the woman insisted, "You can't help your family if you're not strong enough to reach them." With tears in her eyes, Alyssa took a bite of the piece of bread, feeling the energy begin to flow through her body. The woman filled the bag with supplies: rice, bread, dried fruit and water. "Go," she said with a calm firmness. "They need you now, and you're going to make it." Alyssa stood up with the bag, which was heavier than she expected. Each step was a reminder that his mission was not yet over. She left the city and faced the desert again. The journey back would be as difficult as the journey out, but now, with the weight of time and survival even more present. The hot desert winds blow against your face again, and the pain in your feet resurfaces with a vengeance. But now, more than ever, she knew she couldn't give up. Jack and Emily were waiting for her, and the sacrifice of her walk would be their salvation. Desperation still lived in her chest, but there was something stronger that moved her: love for her family. She looked one last time at the city disappearing into the horizon and took a deep breath. Now the last battle began. A battle against time, against nature, and against the limits of the human body. But Alyssa knew that her heart, despite being fragile and tired, still beat strong with the hope of seeing her children smile again. She walked back into the desert, knowing she was closer than ever to saving those she loved.